Good evening, and welcome to the Chatham Marconi Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart, and I'm a volunteer here. We appreciate your participation in the program tonight. As a reminder, you can ask questions by hovering over the bottom toolbar, typing in your question, and at the end of the presentation, Elizabeth will answer the questions. Tonight's speaker, Elizabeth Macalaster, will discuss the history and pivotal role of pigeons as wireless communicators and how they served our country even after radio technology was developed and advanced. It's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth. She is the author of War Pigeons, Winged Couriers in the U.S. Military, 1878 to 1957. She began her career as a marine biologist and turned to science journalism. She worked for the U.S. Department of the Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency on water quality issues. She primarily writes about science and history articles now for newspapers and magazines. She lives with her husband on the coast of Maine, where she likes to hike, row, and watch land and seabirds. She is also the author of several award-winning nonfiction books for children and young adults. Thanks for joining us tonight, Elizabeth, and I'll now turn the presentation over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to Liz McCart and the Marconi Maritime Center for hosting speakers like me via Zoom during the pandemic so we could share our stories. I live in Maine, and one of the silver linings of Zoom has been that I've been able to open the world of homing pigeons to people all over the country. I'm especially pleased to be speaking in Cape Cod this evening, as the region has a very rich history with war pigeons. I wrote War Pigeons, Winged Couriers in the U.S. Military, 1878 to 1957, for one reason. I wanted to move people to take a second look at the most extraordinary bird on our planet. Homing pigeons are rock doves, the same species of pigeon that perches on rooftops and wanders around parks cleaning up after us. But homers are a very special breed of rock dove. They are strong, fast, intelligent athletes, and for 3/4 of a century, they were the U.S. military's most reliable means of communication. I titled my talk this evening, Feathers versus Radio, How Homing Pigeons Bested Marconi, because I wanted to prove to you their superiority over radio waves. While we're at this slide, I want to mention the bird you see here, Peerless Pilot. He was one of the Navy's best couriers in World War I. In 1 year alone, he flew over 200 missions from planes doing scouting runs over the Atlantic Ocean back to his loft on the coast of France. Peerless Pilot exemplifies the strength and the endurance homing pigeons possess. Militaries have enlisted homing pigeons as couriers for thousands of years. One of the earliest documented cases is of Julius Caesar using them to carry messages during his conquest of Gaul a long time ago, 58 to 51 BC. His pigeon handlers might have attached a message to a tail feather, as shown here, or wrapped around the leg of the pigeon. Homing pigeons were especially helpful during sieges when a city was surrounded by the enemy and all communications cut. During the siege of Paris, 1870 to 71, pigeons floated out of the city via balloon to a temporary government in Tours about 130 miles away. There, they were outfitted with messages and sent back. In this image, green crates hold the birds being carried to the balloons. Because microphotography had been developed by then, messages were reduced to tiny bits of text inserted in a bird quill, and then that quill tied onto a tail feather. 150,000 official dispatches and 1 million private messages were delivered by pigeon couriers to Paris during that siege. The enormous and unexpected success of pigeon couriers in the siege prompted many European militaries to include them in their ranks. By the end of the 1880s, a spider web of pigeon messenger routes crisscrossed Europe. Every line you see on this map represents a pigeon route. Some even stretched across water, as you can see from Spain to the Balearic Islands here, and from Italy to Sardinia. Now, about this time, another mode of communication in the air was out there, lurking, waiting to be discovered. A couple of decades earlier, James Maxwell predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves, and all through the 1870s and 1880s, people pondered this idea and tested for the existence of the waves. While militaries were flying homing pigeons over the routes I've just shown you in this map, Heinrich Hertz sent and received wireless waves through space. From Russia to India to the United States, people continued to study radio waves, including a young Italian inventor. The buildup of pigeon forces in Europe did not go unnoticed in the United States. Both the Army and Navy began to experiment with pigeon couriers. The Navy in particular was interested because out at sea, it relied on flags, whistles, horn, and gun signaling during the day and flashing lights at night. But clearly, ships had to be within hearing and sight range for these kinds of communication to work. This early photograph shows the first Navy loft built and populated with pigeons at the Enlisted Training Center in Newport, Rhode Island. And you can see the birds resting on top of the loft there. Birds from this loft were taken on board the USS New Hampshire, the flagship for the enlisted seaman training program. All of the young men lived and trained on board the New Hampshire, and along with training sailors, the ship trained pigeons to navigate from out at sea back to their Newport loft. In 1888, commander of the New Hampshire, Francis J. Higginson, regarded experiments with his pigeons as being very successful. In one instance, he reported, several of our birds were taken to New York on the Juniata with the intention of liberating them along the coast. The weather, however, was thick, and they were not flown. While at Brooklyn, one of the pigeons escaped from the Juniata and considered lost, as it had never flown a distance longer than 14 miles from Newport. Great was our surprise when, in a few days, the bird arrived at his home here safely and in good condition. It's clear that the commander had much to learn about the skills of homing pigeons. Higginson believed that homing pigeons would be of great use to the US Navy, and he was in favor of establishing lofts along the Atlantic coast. But it would take a lot more than the confidence of the commander of a training ship to convince the Navy Department. Help came along a few years later in the form of a French professor. Henri Marion, a pigeon expert and French professor at the United States Naval Academy, standing here in the back row, believed strongly that with homing pigeons, ships could communicate from beyond the line of sight. This was a phenomenon unheard of in our Navy. In 1891, he set out to convince the US Navy Department to fund a pigeon messenger service. With a few birds left over from an army loft, Professor Marion built a pigeon cote or house at the top of the Academy's rigging loft, the tower to the right of the boathouse. To demonstrate their ability to fly over water, Marion spearheaded a series of experiments, taking pigeons out to sea on Academy vessels and releasing them to fly back to their boathouse loft. One of these vessels was the mighty USS Constellation, a sloop of war that had patrolled the world and was now outfitted to train naval cadets. For a few summers, she carried a pigeon cote on her spar deck. It perched on top of the capstan, as shown here, and held a dozen or so birds while out at sea. I'm not quite sure what happened when the capstan was turned to weigh anchor, but surely the sailors placed the cote down on the deck. After 5 years of successful trials, the Navy Department agreed in 1896 to fund 6 lofts on the east and west coasts of the United States. One of those lofts was at the Newport Training Station, and the others were at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, Brooklyn, Norfolk, Key West, and Mare Island Navy bases. 6 were a far cry from 20 that Professor Marion had initially proposed, but it was a start. The lofts look similar to this one at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, all the same size and painted red and white stripes, which the pigeons could see easily from the air. Slightly different, but bearing the same shape and stripes, is the loft built on the West Coast at Mare Island Navy Base, just outside of San Francisco. While the Navy lofts were being built and pigeons bought and trained, Professor Marion patented this message holder, the first to attach to a pigeon's leg. You can imagine how much more secure a message would be as opposed to tying it to a tail feather. This capsule became the prototype for modern pigeon message holders. Professor Marion had no idea how important his design would become. Also, in 1896, another consequential patent was given in England to Guglielmo Marconi for the first radio wave-based communication system. The next year, Marconi opened the first radio station, a factory in Chelmsford, England, followed by a radio station on the Isle of Wight. Things were moving fast in the world of radio waves. Just as the Naval Pigeon Messenger Service was getting started, we entered a war with Spain to free Cuba and the Philippines from Spanish rule. You may recall the battleship, the USS Maine, that blew up mysteriously in February of 1898 in Havana Harbor, contributing to the outbreak of the war in April. And here's the USS Maine sinking in Havana Harbor. Pigeons did carry messages in this war from ships off both coasts of the United States, and they were also part of coast defense plans. But documentation is spotty, and their use seemed to remain mostly experimental. Then in 1901, an event occurred that changed how the world communicated. Marconi sent 3 dots, Morse code for the letter S, across the Atlantic Ocean in a matter of seconds. By 1902, Navy ships were outfitted for wireless. The 6 pigeon cotes shuttered or retrofitted for radio stations, and the birds sold off. That was the end of the first official pigeon message service in this country. The next year, 1903, Marconi erected a large antenna array on 4 200-foot wooden towers in South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, to establish a radio transmitting station. And this is the site where the first wireless transatlantic communication between England and the United States occurred. it became very clear that nothing could compete with the speed of radio waves to carry information. Or could it? Henri Marion died in 1913, while he never realized his dream of a fully feathered pigeon messenger service. He did live long enough to witness the beginning of the rise of homing pigeons into legend. Or in 1903, a new type of bird, one made of wood and cloth and powered by an engine, took to the air. Soon after, the Army and Navy pilots trained pilots to fly these planes, and it wasn't long before homing pigeons accompanied them. Pigeons were just getting started in their service to the military. Homing pigeons were especially valuable in World War I because the Signal Corps' communication technology was not very functional in trench warfare. Radios were crude, they were heavy, they were unreliable, they had short ranges and could be intercepted. Antennas were obvious targets, and there were few trained operators. But radios were often less reliable than telegraph and telephone, but those wires were cut or trampled, and when signalmen crawled out of a trench to repair them, they were shot down. In the pitted, ruined terrain made travel harrowing for human and canine couriers. Homing pigeons got their messages through. About 600 birds were in the Signal Corps' American Pigeon Service. This is a photo of a mobile pigeon loft that stayed to the rear lines where pigeons were raised and trained. When troops had to move, the lofts and pigeons moved with them. Pigeons were carried from their lofts to the front in baskets on the backs of soldiers and Marines, as in this photo, or on the backs of horses, mules, and dogs. This Airedale is crossing a stream with a basket of pigeons on its back. In this slide, soldiers in a trench have attached a message to a pigeon and they're about to release it. Think of it, weighing in at about as much as an apple. Pigeons flew through exploding shells, gunfire, gas, and smoke, hardly wavering even when mortally wounded. This is the war where pigeons became heroes. Pigeoneer J.L. Carney said of the Argonne Forest battle, "Nothing could live above ground, and the trenches and shell holes were filled with dead and wounded. Time after time the attack was on and almost as often repulsed. Division after division was thrown into the line to face the most deadly of modern weapons, the machine gun. With small artillery firing incessantly, high explosive shells dropping everywhere, and gas attacks on hourly, there was little wonder that man-made lines of communication should wither and break. Into the breach went the little racing pigeon, the most gallant bird the world has known. And they came through with messages of weal and woe, came through when shattered troops were crying for aid, when every other line of communication had failed." The best parts of my chronicle, I believe, are the thrilling and poignant stories of these gallant birds serving alongside our soldiers and sailors, airmen, and Marines. Along with machine guns, tanks were a new formidable weapon in World War I, but its noisy, cumbersome crawl didn't affect pigeons that went along as crew. Here, a tanker on the Western Front is releasing an Allied bird out a small window at the side of the tank. While the Army and Marines fought the war on land, the US Navy flew scouting missions from bases on the coasts of England, France, and Italy. With very little training and only a compass to guide them, Navy pilots like Erlen H. Parker, here from Farmington, Maine, flew rickety biplanes over the ocean looking for German submarines and ships. No pilot left without a couple of homing pigeons, which were sent back for help should the plane ditch into the ocean. Hundreds of downed airmen were saved by these remarkable couriers. Parker spoke of another use of his birds when fog was encountered. Out of sight of land, with a compass whirling like a top, he said, we would release the pigeons. Of course, you couldn't follow them in a fog, but you could see them circle and rise and then straight line it for land. That's all we needed to know, the direction of land. Otherwise, a lot of us would have been lost at sea. German submarines cruised the east coast of the United States during World War I, and air stations were built by the Navy to protect the shores. The Chatham Naval Air Station was finished in January 1918 with a mission of ensuring that coastal shipping in Nantucket Sound safely reached Cape Ann to the north. This is an old photo of the air station and shows a large blimp hangar in the background and float plane hangars in the front. Both blimps and Curtiss float planes patrolled the coast looking for German submarines. The air station also had pigeon cotes where homing pigeons were raised and trained to accompany the blimps and planes. Now, although the planes carried a radio, the blimp captains were reluctant to install spark gap transmitters in their hydrogen-filled vessels, as you might imagine, so they preferred to use pigeon messengers. Feathers versus radio, not a difficult question to answer for blimp captains. This is another view of the Chatham Naval Air Station. It's a diorama built by Judy Cuniff, and I'd like to thank her and the Atwood Museum for its use in my talk this evening. You can see the pigeon cote way up here in the right-hand corner. Here, a Curtiss HL-1L flying boat is on patrol from the air station with Eric Lingard at the controls. The flying boats patrol daily, dawn to dusk, always in pairs, with one plane carrying a radio. That pilot radioed in every 10 minutes. Both planes carried 2 homing pigeons for emergency communication with the base. There's some documentation that states that on October 18th, 1918, one of these flying boats ditched in a rough sea about 50 miles from the Chatham Naval Air Station, likely from mechanical problems. The pilot released the pigeons with a message citing their location. The birds made it back to their loft at the air station. 27 hours later, the men were picked up. Feathers versus radio. Am I convincing you? I don't want to leave World War I without mentioning Kaiser. He was a German pigeon captured by American forces in 1918 toward the end of the war. Kaiser was a big, handsome bird, as you can see. He was brought back to the States along with 21 other feathered POWs and installed at the Signal Corps Pigeon Center at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. He was issued comfortable quarters as well as a mate and encouraged to breed more war pigeons. By the 1930s, Kaiser was the last surviving captured German pigeon in American custody, and despite his age, his offspring proved to be champion racers. Some flew in World War II, but this time for the Allies. On February 27th, 1948, Kaiser turned 31. That's nearly twice as long as most pigeons in captivity live. The children at the fort held a birthday party, and Kaiser appeared as the guest of honor. That August, he was given membership in the American Legion's first retread post, number 667 in Los Angeles, on account of his service in 2 wars. On January 20th, 1949, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the inauguration of Harry S. Truman. He was joined by 2 other hero pigeons as part of the Signal Corps exhibition. On Halloween night, 1949, Kaiser passed away at Fort Monmouth at the ancient age of 32. He outlived his namesake, Wilhelm Kaiser, by several years, as well as a number of wives. His bloodline provided the Army with strong war pigeons that served in World War II, and the progeny of his great-great-great-great-grandchildren, sold to the public when the Army dissolved the pigeon service, remain in lofts across our country today, no doubt producing racing champions. Pigeons were so successful as couriers in World War I that after the war, both Army and Navy established large breeding and training centers for birds and pigeoneers, their human handlers. The Army established their center at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and the Navy at Naval Air Station Anacostia, DC. This is Chief Quartermaster Henry Kubeck, in charge of the training at Anacostia. On this day, he is releasing birds from the Potomac River to fly back to their lofts at the base. Pigeons were also released from planes as part of their training. A pilot had to be extremely careful about how and when a bird was let go, lest it be sucked by an air current into the fuselage or a wing. Back at their loft after a training run, the pigeons received royal treatment. Other than a duck, no bird likes a bath more than a pigeon, and here they enjoy one outside. Inside the Anacostia loft, the birds had electricity and running water, and at night, armed guards patrolled the grounds. A special hospital took care of any avian concerns. Only the most cosseted racehorses received care equal to that of the Anacostia homing pigeons. In the 1920s and 30s, military homing pigeons also flew for other government entities, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were flying everywhere. Not 30 years after the war to end all wars, homing pigeons were called up again to serve our country in the Second World War. Despite huge advances in radio technology, such as having longer ranges and mobile walkie-talkies, homing pigeons were relied upon for backup when radio silence was enforced or when other communications didn't work. About 54,000 were trained in this country and 36,000 birds deployed overseas. World War II was fought on 4 continents, and homing pigeons flew messages with the Army at every front. They carried messages across deserts, over snowy mountaintops, through jungles, and over large expanses of ocean. Here, birds are exercising from a loft in snowy Fuda Pass, Italy. In this photo, a mobile loft, also in Italy, has been dug into the ground and camouflaged. Maybe the enemy couldn't spot the loft, but the pigeons never missed it. This is a photograph of an actual message carried by Gustav, a British pigeon that operated in the D-Day landings, June 6, 1944. Gustav was taken across the channel on a landing ship and released by news correspondent Montague Taylor. Gustav traveled the 150 miles to his Royal Air Force loft in 5 hours and 16 minutes in a 30-mile-per-hour headwind. Now, Marconi had sent a radio transmission across the English Channel way back in 1899, but due to radio silence, feathers, not radio waves, carried the first word of the invasion to reach Britain. It says, "We are just 20 miles or so off the beaches. First assault troops landed 0750. Signal says no interference from enemy gunfire on beach, steaming steadily in formation. Lightnings, typhoons, fortresses, airplanes, crossing since 0545. no enemy aircraft seen. For the first time in World War II, pigeons parachuted out of planes, sometimes by themselves, floating to ground in a small crate, or with a paratrooper, as shown here. You can see the pigeon resting comfortably in a specially made vest strapped onto the soldier's chest. This type of vest was developed by Ida Rosenthal, the founder of a Maidenform Brassiers. Designing soft, close-fitting pigeon vests wouldn't have been a problem for her. While the Navy rarely used pigeons on planes or ships in World War II, they included them in crews of airships and free balloons that flew off both coasts of the United States looking for enemy ships and submarines. Here, a pigeon is being released from a blimp on a training run. Again, great care had to be taken to ensure the bird flew safely away from the vessel. Launching the pigeons while aloft was no feat, said a blimp pilot at Moffett Field, California. To clear the prop wash of the blimp, a crewman held the bird's wings down and then threw the critter from a cabin window, much in the same manner as throwing a football. And in this photo, men who have landed in a free balloon sent up from Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, are releasing a pigeon to fly back to base with the location of their landing so they can be picked up. During World War II, a small naval base at Woods Hole was built, and it took over a lot of the waterfront there, as well as the fisheries building and some of the buildings of the Marine Biological Laboratory. A pigeon loft for breeding and training pigeons for naval communication was located on the northern edge of the base. You can see right here the three lofts. One of them was for breeding and one for training, and another one was the sick bay. Lieutenant Donald Comstock, a longtime member of the American Racing Pigeon Union, was in charge of the loft with 3 sailors as assistants. Lieutenant Comstock probably trained the birds to fly back to Woods Hole from Navy boats and ships, doing maneuvers off the coast. In World War II, Waves began to train homing pigeons at naval air stations in the US so that male pigeoneers could deploy. Joy Bright Hancock, one of the founders of Waves, set criteria for being a pigeon trainer. She should be a volunteer for the training, experienced in working with animals, and be able to drive a car in order to retrieve a pigeon in training status that had lost its way, she said. She should be able to learn diseases of birds, their treatment, as well as their care. Of course, she adds, typing experience is desirable. During World War II, every state had a civil defense council that remained prepared in the event of an attack on the home front. Pigeon racing clubs all over the country had already donated thousands of birds to the military to be trained and deployed overseas, but they also gave their birds to defense units to be part of communications plans in the event that other communications broke down or were sabotaged. Here, a member of the Lansing, Michigan Civil Defense Council is releasing a pigeon as part of a drill. Pigeons also flew with other defense organizations, including the Civil Air Patrol and state guards. This photo, also from the Lansing Civil Defense Council, shows how a modern message capsule, after Professor Marion's design, attached to a pigeon's leg. When we entered the Korean War in 1950, radios were still the Army's mainstay of communications. However, homing pigeons yet again formed the backup plan, flying messages over difficult terrain and when other communications failed. Some birds went on covert missions, parachuting with intelligence officers behind North Korean lines. Colonel Douglas Dillard, an infantry officer involved in some of these joint CIA Army airborne missions, described how dangerous the missions were. He said the territory where paratroopers were dropped was remote and inhospitable. Radio communication did not exist. So the agents were dropped with homing pigeons strapped to them. These birds, he said, were often the only means of communication between agents and their CIA and Army handlers waiting back in South Korea. Just a pigeon to let them know they'd drop safely. Again, feathers, not radio waves. And here, despite cold weather, the pigeons in this photo are exercising and enjoying the view from a mobile loft in South Korea. Now I'd like to talk just a little about G.I. Joe, one of America's most famous war pigeons. In World War II, he flew for the Allies in Italy. An air attack had been planned to subdue German presence in the village of Colvivecchia, but the 56th London Infantry had advanced quickly and already secured the village. With the air attack about to commence, the infantry was in danger of being bombed by friendly fire. G.I. Joe was hurriedly released with a message to call off the attack. He flew the 20 miles back to Allied lines in just 20 minutes, reaching at the Allies just as the bombers were revving their engines. His swift flight saved the lives of at least 100 Allied soldiers and many civilians. After the war, G.I. Joe returned to Fort Monmouth, where he retired to the exclusive Churchill loft, meant only for heroes. In 1946, he traveled to London, where he was awarded the Dickin Medal, Great Britain's Victoria Cross for animals. Between 1943 and 1949, the Dickin Medal was awarded to 56 animals, 32 of them pigeons. G.I. Joe is the only American pigeon to win that medal. And here he is in London, being held by an official with the medal around his neck. In 1955, a young pigeoneer named Tommy DeRosa was stationed at Fort Monmouth, and he cared for G.I. Joe. In this photo, Tommy is holding the famous bird in front of the Churchill loft. In 1957, the pigeon and breeding program at Fort Monmouth was closed, and most of the pigeons sold off at auction. Writing later in the Army Communicator, Major Ron Frame described the event. Fort Monmouth looked like a Rolling Stones concert. Pigeon lovers and breeders started to arrive at 2 a.m. to purchase the 1,018 birds that were to be sold. At $5 a pair, a person was allowed to purchase 1 to 5 pairs of birds. All the birds were sold by 11:43 a.m., and hundreds of bird fanciers went home without so much as a feather. The heroes from Churchill Loft went to zoos around the country. G.I. Joe and his mate were welcomed at the Detroit Zoo, where Joe lived to the ripe old age of 18. But G.I. Joe's story didn't end at the Detroit Zoo. On November 15th, 2019, at the Rayburn House on Capitol Hill, the newly established Animals in War and Peace Bravery Medals were presented to honor American war animals. 2 living dogs received the medals, while 3 more dogs, 2 pigeons, and 1 horse received them posthumously. 64 years after serving at Fort Monmouth, Tommy DeRosa was there to receive the medal for G.I. Joe. And here he is standing next to Joe with the new medal. I got to meet Tommy a couple of years ago in Connecticut, where he lives and still raises and races pigeons. I asked him about G.I. Joe and his heroic flight in Italy. Tommy said G.I. Joe was a good bird, but that any other well-trained homing pigeon could have made that trip that quickly. G.I. Joe just wanted to get home. I'm going to end there. And if you're interested in buying my book. You can do so via Amazon or McFarland, the publisher, or through your local bookstore. I've also included just a couple of websites here. The American Racing Pigeon Union is the national organization that oversees pigeon raising and pigeon racing. And the American Pigeon Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I had planned to go there last year, but we'll have to wait until this year or next year. And then I also included Jim Jenner's website. He is a producer and a documentary filmmaker and also a pigeon aficionado. He used to raise and race them as a kid. And he has put out a wonderful series of films about all kinds of different aspects of racing pigeons. And then the last one especially interested me. It is a website that describes a new museum and a memorial that is being funded right now. And it's spearheaded, the effort to fund this is being spearheaded by a woman named Robin Hutton. She is an author and also a writer and a producer. And she wrote a very good book called Reckless, America's War Horse, about a horse that served with Marines in Korea. And she's spearheading this effort to build a museum and a memorial to war animals. A number of countries have memorials to animals and pigeons in particular, but this country does not. So I hope it comes to fruition. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I would like to leave you with one. Given the increase in extreme weather events and cyber attacks, including one just last month in your backyard on the Steamship Authority of Massachusetts Ferry Service, should our military and or Homeland Security maintain a flock of trained homing pigeons to use if communications fail? China is already doing so. According to some reports from about 9 or 10 years ago, the People's Liberation Army is training up to 50,000 homing pigeons to deliver military information in the event the country's communication system breaks down. The PLA believes pigeons are the best means of short and medium distance communication if a collapse of signals occurs. So what do you think now? Feathers or radio waves? I know which one I would vote for. And thank you for coming, and I will stop screen sharing now.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. That is a remarkable story in a lot of ways. First of all, the fact that pigeons served our country for so many years is remarkable, and it's nice to see that G.I. Joe got his recognition, and animals should get their recognition. So also very interesting about the local connections that maybe some of us were not aware of. So very interesting. Thank you. Also, thank you for including the references for people. I think some of our audience is always interested in looking further into reading or research on the topic. So thanks for that. So we do have some questions coming in, and as a reminder, you can type them in and we will have Elizabeth answer them. So Elizabeth, I will start with the questions. We have one from Sarge, and he would like to know, how did they train the pigeons?
Yes, they train them first here in this country, and they would first train them from a stationary loft. And when they're a few weeks old but can fly, they just take the youngsters out for a very short flight. They might just put them in a car, maybe just a quarter of a mile away. And then they keep lengthening the distance that they release the pigeons to fly back to their lofts. And that's how the pigeons learn to fly home. Finally, they will release them from, say, 100 miles away. And once the birds could find their way home, then after, say, 100 or 200 miles, the military felt they were ready to then go overseas. When they got overseas, they were mostly trained to fly from mobile lofts. So again, they would start that here. And now you not only have a loft you have to figure out how to get home to, that loft moves. So they would move the loft around all different places. So the pigeons became aware that they would have to find a loft that moved. And many of the trainers realized that they needed to breed the pigeons, not necessarily for speed, but for intelligence, because they had to live in mobile lofts. And I just want to add something I've been amazed about is how they're able to navigate. And there's growing evidence that pigeons, as other animals like bats and fish and sea turtles, they have a kind of an internal compass that allows them to know which way is north and south. And pigeons have iron crystals in their beaks, and that acts as a kind of a compass. But they also have super sensory powers. And they use these super senses to form this sensory map that helps them find their way home. For example, on a clear day, they can see 26 miles. And they can see ultraviolet light, which we cannot. And that allows them to see details that we cannot see. They have superb hearing. We can hear down to 20 hertz. They can hear down to 0.05 hertz. And if I've done my math right, that means they have about 400 times more acute hearing. They also have excellent smell. So they use all of these skills to navigate home.
That's incredible. Now,
It is incredible.
Did you mention that one of the lofts was red and white stripes? So do they look for their loft based on color or shape?
Yes, both. So of course, some of the lofts on the battlefield, as you saw, were either dark colored or even camouflage. So they would have to remember the shape of their loft, if it had branches over it, or because I don't believe in actual wartime they would be bright colored. Mm-hmm. Certainly not.
Right.
So yes, they would have to learn the color and the shape, the size, and if it was in the open or if it was in camouflage. Again, they bred them for intelligence.
Yeah, it sounds like quite a bit of training involved.
Was.
Now, Fran has a couple questions. Fran's first question is, are they fed special diets?
Yes, they are. They're fed a very special mixture of grains and corn and peas, and they also get a lot of vitamins, and they get vaccinations. And yes, and they always had to make sure they had fresh water. That was very, very important. I read one quote in World War II where a pigeoneer said this took place in northern Africa, where they were used a lot there. If there was but one cup of water, the pigeons were always given a drink first. So yes, their food and their water was extremely important to their health, because if they were not healthy, they would not fly their best. And the soldiers' lives would depend on that.
Thank you. Well, they had remarkable endurance. I think you said one flew 22 hours. So that was without stopping?
They could fly all day long without stopping if they're trained. They don't like to fly at night though. So I've read stories about rescues of downed aircraft at sea, and they release a pigeon at dusk, and the pigeon would make it back to land, but would roost until the morning. They don't like to fly at night. Some people tried to train them to fly at night, but it never really worked all that well. They would run into telephone wires, and they couldn't. But an effort was made to try and train them at night, but it didn't really work very well.
Okay, thanks. Fran's other question is, were both females and males used?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Both of them were. Mm-hmm. And one as much as the next. Yep.
Thank you. Tom said, great slideshow and super research. Thank you.
Thank you.
He would also like to know, do you have ideas about how the pigeons might think about their keepers? Did they recognize individual humans? Do they have affection for people?
From my research and my discussions with pigeoneers and this fellow, for example, Tommy DeRosa and others, I would say that the pigeons certainly did know who their keepers were, and they they perhaps established a bond, but I would conclude that the bond for the birds only meant a safe, clean home and the availability of a nest and a mate. Probably in the rare instance, you might have had some other kind of bond, but from the birds' point of view, probably not. From the humans' point of view, of course, yes, they established deep, deep bonds with these birds. The birds, after all, were at times their only means of hope. And but the bird probably it cares much more about getting back to its mate and its nest. And if the human helps that, yeah, like the human.
Okay, thanks. Liz, one of our viewers, would like to know how many pigeons were involved in World War II.
For us, as I said, 54,000 were trained. 36,000 were deployed overseas. I've read where 250,000 birds flew for Great Britain. So I've never been able to find a total number of birds for that war. 1 million. I mean, if you include German birds too, everyone used them. They used birds a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if that number reached 1 million, but I've never been able to find an exact number except for how many we used. And then Britain used 250,000.
Thank you. You showed us a message that was written. Would that be the typical size of a message and length?
Yes. So that was a typical message and a typical piece of paper and a form that it was written on. It would have been very thin paper and rolled up and bent and then fit into the capsule, which is, probably that big, maybe 1.5 inches. Yeah, an inch, maybe an inch and a half
I see.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that message wasn't encrypted. Were they?
No,
Yeah. Did they
no.
encrypt the messages
Yes.
eventually?
Yes, so sometimes the messages were coded and sometimes they were open. And no, that one was not, but I guess they didn't feel the need. But yes, they were also written in code.
Okay. And along those lines, Ronald has a question. Were there any efforts by enemy forces to intercept pigeons?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they would shoot them down and they would send falcons and hawks after them.
Oh,
And a falcon or especially a falcon can outfly a pigeon. And Tommy told me that the pigeoneers knew their birds so well that if one or few of them flew over, they would know if it was their unit's birds or not. And if they weren't, that they would shoot them down.
I see.
They knew them that well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they had important information, it seems, that they would want to intercept them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
Mhm.
you.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like those are all the questions that we have. And Elizabeth, we do greatly appreciate your time. Your enthusiasm for your subject and depth of knowledge is amazing. So we thank you for sharing that. We do have another comment from Ronald. Thank you, very enlightening. So he enjoyed the presentation.
Well, thank you. And I hope I've changed the minds of a few of you about pigeons, and I hope you never look at one in the same way again.
Yeah, I think you've given us a different perspective, and a certain amount of respect for what they have done and you know what their ancestors did. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. So as a small token of our appreciation, we will be sending you this Chatham Marconi Maritime hat.
Thank
We'll
you.
get it off in the mail to you, and so you can wear it when you come down and visit us when you're able to do that.
That's
and
great.
just for
Thank
our
you.
audience, I'd like to thank you for participating tonight and look forward to seeing you on our July 22nd presentation, which will be by two captains who are professors now at Mass Maritime. They will be talking about ship technology and how ships communicate and stay safe at sea, and the education and licensing that goes along with it. Also, keep watching our website for upcoming details on finally our two in-person and Zoom presentations. We're very excited to be in person again, but we will continue to Zoom for our audience that enjoys that. So thank you for being here. And Elizabeth, do you want to compliment her pigeon brooch that she's wearing that a friend made for her? So thank you all, and good night.
Good evening, everybody. Bye.